Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Google Hangout with Sylvia Orli and John Boggin at Department of Botany, the Natural History Museum. I'm Megan Farrader. I'm the project coordinator. You hear from me via social media and emails. And today we're going to talk about the US National Herbarium collection, explore some of the specimens, and learn about transcribing. I just wanted to ask you, if you're watching, you're welcome to communicate with us and share questions via Twitter at transcribesi. You can use Google Chat and also email us transcribe@si.edu. You can also use the hashtag BotanyBuffs because that's what we're becoming today, learning about how to transcribe more effectively. I want to give you some details about the work that you have done together collaboratively. Since November 2013, we've had botanical specimen sheets in the Transcription Center, and we've been transcribing their labels. We've done over 11,700 records together. Just under 500 of you have worked on these, and we finished 19 projects. So that's a pretty phenomenal amount of work, and we have much work ahead of us. So we want to make sure that we're transcribing these things correctly and learning about the history of the collection itself. So let me introduce you today, Sylvia Orli, who's the IT manager for Department of Botany. Her career began researching pollen grains and has blossomed into a career of managing data here at the Department of Botany. And John is a museum specialist and part of Sylvia's informatics team, and his background includes entomology and botany, so some of you may have questions about the entomological specimens that we have for transcription as well. And pick John's brain. I asked them some of the questions about themselves, including what were their favorite places here at Smithsonian, and they both said Smithsonian Gardens.
Definitely. It's definitely in the spring and the summer. Time to come.
Yep, so we'll be looking forward to seeing those gardens grow this spring. So let's go ahead and get started. Sylvia, would you tell us a little bit more about your role and how you became interested in managing the collections?
Well, let me just give a little background. I'm actually a wildlife science major in college and in graduate school, but I came to the museum back in 1992, and I worked in the museum, in the Department of Vertebrate Zoology in mammals. And I once had to deliver a note to the botany department, and I went down to the botany department, and I was surrounded by all these cases of plants, and I fell in love. I just decided that was where I wanted to be. I didn't want to be up in mammals anymore. And so I applied for a job, and I got the job. So that's how I started here as a museum technician. And I worked my way up to being website manager and now the manager for IT. So yeah, we have a team of 4 people. We have John, who's the type manager. We also have a multimedia specialist and a data manager and myself. So as a team, we manage all of the digital resources of the department, including the specimen records, all images that come from specimens. We have live plant images. We have botanical illustrations. And we also have outreach in the way of our own botany website.
Excellent. So what are the best parts of your job?
That's an interesting question, because I think that we work in a very unusual place, and that is we are surrounded by plants, and we're surrounded by scientists who really care about what they do, and they really care about conservation. And I think that is really amazing in itself, and it makes for a very vibrant workplace.
Can either of you give an estimate of how many scientists are maybe actually in-depth using the collection on any given day or a week?
Are you talking internally or
worldwide?
Worldwide.
I'm specifically referring to here in person internally.
I would say at least 20 on any given day.
Okay.
And John, what do you think?
What, you mean staff, or does that include like volunteers or visiting researchers?
Yeah, just to give an idea of who's using the collection.
It really varies, but we do have a lot of visitors who might come in just for a day or two,
right,
visiting from other countries or other herbaria.
Right.
So it's really hard to give a number because it fluctuates a lot.
I understand.
But it definitely gets a lot of use.
Yeah. Great.
And the other thing is that because we now have so many specimens online digitally, there aren't as many visitors, but we know that our material is being searched because we get quite a few online queries of our specimen data.
Right, and that's exactly what our volunteers are experiencing, being part of that digitization process and hopefully making the data more useful for researchers around the world.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the US National Herbarium collection.
So the US National Herbarium is located in the National Museum of Natural History in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. You said it.
Yeah, it's almost a tongue twister.
Exactly. So we are a herbarium, one of the largest in the world, and we have 5 million botanical specimens. Collections from all over, so anything from collection of a sequoia tree all the way down to something very small like a dinoflagellate or a diatom. We have algae, we have lichens, flowering plants, we have ferns. We have a lot of different types of collections. The US National Herbarium started as a repository for collections from the U.S. government expeditions. So that was back in 1848 when the Smithsonian started. It gave a place for these U.S. government expeditions to put their collections. And I actually have an example of the Wilkes expedition, which is one of our earliest. So it was from 1838 to 1842. And I can show a label.
And volunteers, as we're going to move this camera over to show you the label. And as we're doing that, you may remember, if you have transcribed material from National Anthropological Archives, that we have materials from the Wilkes expedition in the Transcription Center. Yeah. And as they're completed, you can take a look at them and see what kinds of specimens were being collected at the time.
So here is a label. Now, if any of you think that you have a hard time with labels now, think about these labels. This is the entire, I'm having trouble, it's herbarium sheet, okay, and this is the label from somewhere around 1840. And this was collected, I think this is the one from California. The labels, when we received them, were so old and so black that they had to be treated with ultraviolet light to lighten them up. Otherwise, we couldn't read any of the text. So some of these are extremely old, although I would say that the US Herbarium does not have the oldest specimens. There are plenty of herbaria in Europe that have specimens that are much older than ours. Oh yeah.
Wow. We do have some fairly old ones, though. We do have some going back to the 1700s.
Great. And
would older than our country.
Would you just explain a little bit about these spots on the edges of the sheet?
Oh, sure, yeah. Okay.
Thanks for your patience, volunteers.
Yeah, sorry, I got the camera issues here. Okay, so let me see if I can get that showing. Okay.
Let's see.
If I raise it up. You know, it's not focusing.
That's okay. Yeah. Well, maybe we'll just describe it. Okay. You might have seen it.
Okay. So basically, on the edges of these herbaria sheets, maybe I can just hold it up. There are all sorts of black spots, and that's not mold. Okay, that is actually how we used to treat the herbarium specimens for insect damage, so that we would keep the insects away by using mercury. So all this material.
So they're poisoned, basically.
Yeah, they were poisoned. The problem is that, as we know, it can also poison us.
Right.
So a lot of work that we do here in the US National Herbarium is trying to get rid of all this mercury that's on the sheets. So that is a work in progress. Nowadays, the herbarium cases are actually sealed so that they, the insects really they can't get into the cases. The other thing is that before we accept any specimens or new collections, they're frozen. So any insects will die before they actually reach the herbarium.
Excellent. Well, John, would you mind telling us a little bit about your role in your daily tasks and activities as well?
Well, I've had a bunch of different roles within the department. My current role is I work on Sylvia's team, like she said, working mainly with our type specimens, our type herbarium. We have a little over 100,000 type specimens. Okay. And type specimens are the specimens that a researcher is actually looking at when they're describing a new species. Wow. When they write that description and they publish it, for something that's new, they will, or ideally they will say, this is the specimen that I looked at, or this is the collection I looked at. And so those specimens are valuable because you know that they are the specimens that the researcher actually used. So you can be sure that that's what it really is.
Wow. So what's the term holotype mean?
Well, holotype is a relatively new term, actually, just dating to the 20th century.
Oh, wow.
A holotype, specimens are often collected in duplicates, or I should say collections are made in duplicates. And so a collector might go out in the field and collect 10 branches from a tree and press them as 10 different specimens. And those are considered duplicates because they're all part of the same collection. But then you can send them to different herbaria, and we may have only one of those. Now, a person describing a new species will say, this one particular specimen is the holotype. So it is the type specimen. That name will be attached to that particular specimen forever.
Okay.
But then the duplicates of that specimen, or the duplicates of that collection, are then isotypes. It's kind of a fine distinction.
I see.
I see.
Okay.
Yeah.
So equal. Right.
Yeah.
So
this kind of stuff makes sense to me, but
Right.
it takes a while to pick up.
This is great to be learning.
Yeah.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about collecting in sets and how that works?
Well, like I just said, a collector will often make multiple collections of one particular plant. Or if it's like a small plant, like a trillium, say, they might collect 10 individuals from the same population. But they'll put the same collection number. It's considered a gathering. So it's all by the same collector on the same date at the same locality.
Right.
And the collector will often put the same number on all of them. Now, in the case of a tree, it may actually all come from the same individual plant. In the case of something like a trillium, they may be individuals within a population.
Right.
And how do we know where to send those? Like, let's say, I think that John was describing earlier that if back in a long time ago, 100 years ago, people would collect and then they would sell basically a subscription to their collections so that the herbaria around the United States or around the world would actually pay to have that collector send them their specimens. Now it's a much more reciprocal type of arrangement where the botanical collectors are affiliated with an institution, and then the institutions have reciprocal agreements for sending specimens to each other, so that if, let's say, I collect and I get 10 sets of something, I'll send those out to institutions we have agreements with, and they will send us the sets from their own botanical collectors.
Interesting. We have some field notes that are associated with the Field Book Project from people like Joseph Nelson Rose, and he writes about receiving specimens. Would that be that kind of practice that's happening? That he's got people who are donating things, but maybe also requesting from other herbaria?
Yeah, and back then it wasn't uncommon to purchase collections, to purchase entire herbaria or purchase individual specimens.
Which is why a lot of times you'll see those, the labels will say something like, herbarium of, John Smith, because the US National Herbarium may have acquired that herbarium at some point, may have paid for it. It may have also been donated to us. So it's a safe place if that person passed away.
Right, really interesting. And what does it take for a researcher to submit to the National Herbarium?
Well, what do you mean by submit?
I guess I'm thinking they are in the field, they feel they have discovered something, or they want to confirm a specimen. Would they send a submission?
Sure.
Generally not on, they would generally check with us first, because we want to make sure that things are collected legally. There's a lot of legal issues involved in collecting, especially if you're collecting in other countries. So we want to make sure that everything that's being collected has been collected legally. And in a lot of cases, you do need permits either to collect a particular group of plants like orchids, or to collect in a particular country or a particular locality, like in a national forest. So generally, we don't accept unsolicited specimens.
But if we do actually from other institutions receive what they call gift for names, so basically they all have collected a set of plants, they want us to put a name on the plant and send them the information about the taxonomic name, but then we get to keep the collection.
Oh, wow.
That
really
happens quite a bit.
And then one last question, which is, what are some active places where maybe an expedition or collecting is happening that you could share with us? Is there any sponsored expeditions currently?
All
All over the place. Yeah,
over, yeah.
The whole world. We
Okay.
have
Wow.
expeditions.
I mean, you mean from our herbarium or just in general?
From our herbarium.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
we have China.
Okay.
We have Africa. We have the West Indies right now. We have collections in California. We have collections in, did I say Africa?
Mm-hmm.
We have.
There have been several expeditions to China.
Yes.
I mean, for example,
right.
June
Mongolia
travels to China quite a bit.
Right.
It's really great for us to have an understanding that this is active.
Yes.
You know, this is happening
Right.
all the time.
Oh,
This
yeah,
is active
yeah,
practice, and we're as much looking at historical as
Right.
active populations
course.
warrior.
The herbarium, when I say it's 5 million specimens, well, you know, as I'm speaking, it's probably 5 million plus, 500 because
right.
we receive new material every day.
And no one's ever actually counted them.
Yes,
Right.
5 million is a guess.
Yeah. It's our best estimate.
All right, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about some of the details of transcribing now.
Okay.
So I think we're going to screen share.
Yes,
Yep.
that's right.
Okay, so volunteers stand by as we transition here to screen share. We are going to bring up these here and make sure that we've got some good examples to show you. Excellent. So let's show you this first example here.
Well, I chose for the first one an easy example of a sheet to transcribe.
And we've zoomed in here. This is the label from this particular specimen sheet.
Okay, so what I wanted to point out with this one is that you are not necessarily going to be gathering the information about where this was collected, what country and what territory, by just looking at the label. I mean, if you knew enough about geography, you could guess at it. But what I would prefer that you do is take one of the locality names and put that into geonames, which I'm sure all of you use because that's in our instructions. But do you want to?
Yeah, let's go ahead and show geonames. So we're going to show geonames now.
Right. Okay.
So hopefully you're familiar with the site because you use it every day when you transcribe.
Right, and you can't do without it. Okay. So can we go back to the label really fast? Okay. And then
we're going to look at the label.
Right. And I think that we, if I were to concentrate on anything in here, I would say, okay, what is the largest town that I think I can see? And in my mind, that would be Aarhus. Okay. So that's Aarhus.
Okay.
Okay. And we're going to type that in.
Aarhus.
Okay. And you notice that I didn't choose a country. That's because although it said Denmark at the top of the label, I don't know that it was collected in Denmark. It doesn't say that specifically. So let's search on that. Okay. So then we actually see, okay, Aarhus is in Denmark. And then the next level of administrative division in that country is Central Jutland. Okay, so that would be your territory. Denmark would be the country.
So let's look back at what we would be transcribing. So here we see country, Denmark, territory, Central Jutland.
Right. Okay, and then the rest of the information can be put into precise locality. You'll notice I didn't put the rest of it, in Fraxinus, which is an ash, and then Elixir wood together with anemone nemorosa. That is all habitat and habit information that we're not interested in. So we're only going to be collecting where you're going to find the plant, not what with you're going to find the plant.
That's really great clarification. I think we get questions from volunteers often who say, are you sure you don't want this information? And although it's important, it's not going to help us improve these records and make them searchable.
The other thing is that, we can include habitat information in precise locality, but the habitat information has to refer to where the plant is. So if we say, 10 meters from forest, that's different than saying shrubby brushland. We do want that information, but it's not necessary for the locality. So when in doubt, put it in the precise locality field. But if it really just looks like habitat information, you can leave it out.
Okay. Let's move on to the second example here. Oops, and you see that this was one that was not transcribed.
No.
So the system
Interesting.
wanted to save my data for me.
Ah, okay.
So let's zoom in here on
the
the label data.
Okay. So in this case, this is one that I think all of us who are geographically challenged would say, well, the country is England. You know, of course, England's a country, but the England is actually not a country. It is part of the United Kingdom. In this case, you may be confused by that. Again, you need to go back to geonames. And in this case, you can either put in England as, you know, where is this? Because you're not going to find it in the country drop-down list. Or you can even go more refined and put in Monk's Wood and find out if that's a place name. There's the Hunts is referring to something that I'm not really sure what it is. So what I would do is I would go and Google that name.
Okay.
So I can find out, what is Hunts? Is that Huntsville? Is that Huntsford? You know, I don't know. And
there's some obscure British term that we're not
right,
familiar with.
exactly.
Yeah.
So we would use, this is really, really great tip. So this is just to say, everyone, that this is the standard practice is to use Google to search on this. So we would use the context of that locality information and kind of specifically hone in on the term to figure out what hunts means.
Right, exactly. And the other thing is, keep in mind that other herbaria may have already transcribed this exact record or records that are near to it. So another trick that we often use is to Google the locality and the collector as one search. And sometimes,
great tip.
You can actually get,
or you can add the collection date also.
Yeah, the collection date. You can get a lot of information by Googling parts of the label and seeing what other herbaria have to say about what they think the label contains. Now, having said that, and I want to make an emphasis on this, there's no such thing as a perfect label. There's no such thing as a perfect record for a label. We can think we have a perfectly done inventory record, and then a day later figure out that there is a completely different interpretation of that locality. We can find out other information. So the point I'm trying to make is that do not stress about having a perfect record. We don't necessarily even agree what a perfect record is. And sometimes we don't even among ourselves think that what the other person put down is correct.
Well, that's good to know.
Yes.
And actually, sometimes the labels themselves are wrong. Sometimes the data on the labels.
Very interesting.
Sometimes because people make mistakes. People are human.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
and that's one of the reasons why we try to use a system of review, even in the Transcription Center, is because sometimes we slip up when we're correcting entering label data.
Right. I would say that if you're only transcribing, don't sweat the details too much, but try to do the best you can. For the reviewers, I do expect a much higher level of review, but I think that the ones of you who are reviewing are doing a great job, and I really appreciate the level of thoroughness that you have had, because that certainly saves us a lot of time.
That's right. All right, so let's look at this third example.
All right. Okay, now this is the common issue that I have with Indonesia. And Indonesia is a complex country because it is made of many, many islands. It's made of many places. I have people trying to put Borneo in as a country, or Sumatra, when in fact it's all incorporated into Indonesia. In this case, we see that there's division, Padang Sea, I can't pronounce Dimpoyan, and then Padang Lawas. And what I see a lot of is people trying to transcribe directly off the label. So they'll say, oh, well, the first division must be Padang Sea Dimpoyan, when in fact that has changed. So I really would prefer that the transcribers go back to geonames and again put in one of those towns that you'll see on the label. In my case, I put in the words Hota and Baro into geonames, and then it was able to give me all the information that I wanted to know. The other thing that, if you're worried about losing information, make sure to put everything that isn't in country and territory in precise locality, including what's on the top of the labels. So I include Sumatra, I include the next word, but because I Googled it, I realized it was actually the wrong spelling. The current spelling is spelled a different way. So I added that as well in brackets. And that's important to put in brackets so that we understand that that's the modern translation.
Right. So in this, are there particular regions where we should really be focused on this kind of activity?
Right. Indonesia and Philippines.
Okay.
Cameroon is another one. Madagascar is particularly problematic.
I would say a lot of the African countries, because a lot of them have a lot of their collections were made during the colonial era.
Right.
And so a lot of them have archaic country names, archaic locality names. So yeah, Googling actually helps a lot with a lot of those. Or I guess so geo. What is it? Geonames.
Geonames.org. Right.
Well, that picks up the archaic names also, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah,
It can. It can.
Yeah.
Sometimes no, and that's another time when you need to use Google or another search engine and see what you can find. It's amazing to me how much information is out there.
Yeah.
It's a rare label that I can't find something about, and usually if I try hard enough, try different spellings, I can get enough information to fill in these fields.
Excellent. Okay, so let's move on to the fourth example. And again, this was one that wasn't transcribed. So let me zoom in here.
I think actually this one did save. So
yeah, okay. So a little overzealous there.
Okay. Let me see. Now, this is an easier one, but I wanted to point out again that I guess I should point out that there is no format that the labels will follow. And that's nowadays, modern labels will follow a very specific format. But, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, they didn't necessarily follow a format of where all the different fields are. In this case, the collector name is actually at the top. So we have O. Degeneer and E. Ordonez as the two collectors, and the collector number is right next to their names. But you'll see that underneath the taxonomic name of Claoxylon vitiensis, there is the word DET period and then L Crozat. And in fact, DET refers to determiner. Okay.
This is a great detail.
Yeah.
We get this question a lot and has stumped many a transcriber.
Yes, right. Determiner is the person who determines the taxonomic name for the plant. Now, there's another abbreviation you'll see a lot is LEG, which is we're going to figure that out.
I've never actually seen it spelled out. It's an abbreviation for a Latin word. It's legatus or something. Don't quote me on that. But it means collector.
It means collector, and so LEG period, which is almost always the way you'll see it on a label, it refers to the collector themselves. So det for determiner is not the person that you want to use as the collector.
And I think some of our some of the specimen sheets that we've seen said repeatedly determined by Killip, and we have some of Killip's field notes as well. So was he going back through the collections and determining this?
Killip was very active. He made a lot of his own collections. He was very he published a lot. He actually put a lot of names on specimens that were never published before he died.
Oh,
so we actually have a lot of his unpublished names on specimens.
Wow, very interesting.
In some cases, but the guy was very active.
And he probably traveled to many herbaria.
Yeah.
And what we call annotated a specimen. So by annotation, you'll see these little labels on the herbarium sheets that have the taxonomic names, and those are called annotation labels. And you'll see that'll say on it determined by a certain person, and that actually refers to the person who's naming the plant. And as the plant is reviewed by many different botanists, you might see many labels on one specimen because it may be redetermined.
Yeah, they may just disagree on the identification.
Right, or the name may change.
Yeah, yeah.
So the one thing also is that you'll see down below, there's the Pacific Cruise of Ching Ho, 1940-1941, sponsored by Mrs. Anne Archbold. The sponsor is not the person who's also the collector. You know, that is the person who is actually paying for this expedition.
Very interesting.
Yeah, right. Okay.
All right. Are we ready for the next example?
Yes. Okay, this is the one that we think is a little complicated.
That's right. It's a little bit of a challenge. So let's see.
Right.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah, this is one of the bad ones.
Right. This is the kind of label that stumps everybody, and I know I'm going to receive many questions on it. If you'll notice, there is no collector date. There is a collector number at the top, thankfully, but there's no collector. Where's the collector? And the truth is that we don't know. We see debt, I think it's Burek, well, that's the determiner. What we don't have is the name of the collector. What we do have is the words Hort, a Bog, which is standing for Bogar, which is basically the Bogar herbarium. So
Well, it was a botanical garden also.
oh, botanical garden,
Botanical
right?
garden and herbarium.
And herbarium, right? So in that, and that is in Java, which you can see on the label.
Right.
So in this case, there is actually a collector name that is called Colt and Hort Bogor. Okay, so it's like exactly what you see on the label that we have on our drop-down list.
Okay.
It's not really a collector, but it's the best we can do with a label like this.
Right. We try, when we see material coming from a herbarium and with no collector name on it, what we can do is say X herb, which you'll see actually at the top of the label, X herb in Hort bot Bogor. And so that's the coming from the herbarium of horticulture. What's that stand for? Botanic Gardens of Bogor. So the other thing is that in this case, it does say specifically it's cultivated. Okay, and you'll see cult, and in that case, yes,
C-U-L-T period. Yeah.
Right. Just point back to this. So we want to make sure that we
check that. Right,
this
exactly.
to say cultivated.
Yeah, and in that case, it does say uncultivated, but in other cases, you may have to use judgment on whether it's cultivated or not. If it says found in garden, if it says planted by, if it says, you know, give me some examples. Like it's a lot of our specimens say greenhouse number right
on them.
Right.
In a case like that, it's almost certainly from cultivation.
Okay.
Right. So
Great.
Now, however, if you see something that says naturalized in the garden or weed in garden, that is not cultivated. That is, in fact, a plant that's there on its own, and therefore we would not check the cultivated box, right? Even if it is in a botanical garden.
Right. All right. One last example.
Yeah, this is one for John, which I thought was complex, and I wanted him to explain.
Yeah, let me get a closer look at this one.
Sure.
Okay. So what made you think that this was a difficult one then?
Okay. Well, what made me think it is a difficult one is the fact that there is no collector. There are a number of names. One of them, it says there's two herbarium it's presenting itself from. It's in French, and there doesn't seem to be a country on it. So there's a number of things going on here.
Well, if I were looking at this specimen, the first thing I would do is basically discount what you see at the very bottom. It says Herbarium of George Curling Jode, presented by the Royal Gardens Q 1882. And that's a much later date than the date on the label. That text down at the bottom is basically just saying that it was a gift from one person to another or from one institution to another. And that's just about the history of the specimen. That has nothing to do with a collection.
Right.
So in that case, you want to go up to the top where it says Herbier A. Thevenot, and that just means the herbarium of A. Thevenot. I would say in a case like this, 90% of the time it was collected by that person. That's a person's name at the top. But you can't be 100% sure. If you know who this collector is, if you're working, if you're familiar with how this person worked, you might know that he only collected his own specimens. But me just looking at this, I have no idea. I don't know who that is. I've never seen his name before. So all I know is that it came from his herbarium. So this would be a case where you would say X herb A70.
In the collector name. And so there may be actually a choice for that. You know, there is an option, or you can just type it in. It's always fine to type in collector name or X herbarium such and such if you need to. You don't have to choose from the autofill.
That's a great tip as well.
Yeah. Now, John, what am I going to do? It says April 1866. There's no day.
Yeah, there's no day. It's April 1866.
So
and that was actually fairly common back then. They often made collections that didn't note the day. They sometimes didn't note the month. They sometimes didn't note the year. And the older the collections are, the less data you frequently see on them. And the worse and the more vague the data often are.
So when you see something like that, please give us as much of the date information as there is. So put in April, put in 1866. If you only see the number 18 and nothing else on the label, well, and it looks like it should have been a date, well, that implies to us that it was collected sometimes in the 1800s. So in the year field, put in 18 -- and then we'll know, well, it wasn't collected in the 1900s or the, you know, after that. So,
a little bit of sleuthing work sometimes.
Exactly.
Now, what I thought you might think was tricky about this is where was it collected?
Right. Okay. So tell me how I would figure that out.
Well, in this case, I just suspected that this was the locality where it says Bezeiers, and I'll tell you, I'm really good at reading bad handwriting because my handwriting is really bad itself.
We need your help.
But in this case, I can actually read. That's actually better than a lot of handwriting I've seen, and it's Bezeiers. And if you look that up, if you just Google that,
or geonames,
you'll discover that that is a locality in France. And since the rest of the label is in French, and the collector's name looks French, that makes a lot of sense. So the country is France. And then that's probably Béziers would be the locality. Now, in the parentheses after that, I can't quite read that, so I'm not sure about that.
Right. And if you can't figure it out, type it the way you see it, but also put in brackets SP period ? And that will let us know you're not totally sure of the spelling on that. A lot of the very old specimens, like this one you can see is 150 years old.
Right.
What it would happen is that the people who would make the labels, whoever they were, it could have been Thevenot, it could have been his helper, well, they would have to make many duplicate labels. First of all, they had many collections, and then they might have 10 sets. So they were writing out these labels one after the other by hand, you know, with who knows, maybe with a quill pen. I mean, so there's so much work into making these labels, and their handwriting would just get worse and worse as they kept writing. And so we have to forgive them a bit for this bad handwriting. Because
but a lot of them just had bad handwriting in general.
Exactly, and then they just had bad handwriting. So there you are. That's why you'll see some of them are just illegible because
we often think about this with the field notes and some of the logbooks as well, where you think, we know that they knew that part of what they were doing would be read by somebody, but they probably didn't think transcribers in 2014 and 2015 would be.
But it's especially difficult if it's in another language.
Right.
Because if it's in English, you can often read bad English handwriting just because you know the context. You can guess what the words are. But in another language where you're not familiar with it, that can get really tricky.
Exactly.
So we'll take as much as you can give us, and you know, maybe we can collaborate together as volunteers to try and.
Now, do you have them use illegible, like illegible in brackets? Okay.
Yeah, they can either that or they can do SP period ?
Yeah. Okay.
Just some indication that they weren't quite sure what the word was. And that is the same with even the collector. You can say, you know, collector as opposed to collector unknown, which you would use if there was no collector, you couldn't find anything on the label, you can write collector illegible.
Okay.
And that's another fair choice.
Okay. I have a quick question coming in from some of our volunteers. When you're not sure what the word is, in your SP question mark, do you want them to try and make a guess at the word and then
Yes.
write SP question mark?
Make a guess first. Try. Now, you might be right. You
That's
never
right.
know. Right. Don't put SP period without anything, then we'll think it's the word before, and then we'll be confused.
Thank you so much for that answer. All right, so we're gonna stop our screen share and go back to our webcam here. And we have actually run on a little bit in our time, so maybe we can have a couple of like final questions or some consistent issues that you see, additional that you can think of?
Well, one question that I did get, which I thought was actually a very good question, is what are we doing with this data?
It's a great question.
You know, why? I mean, what are we doing with it? So can we pull up, sorry to share this screen one more time.
Yeah,
but,
let's go back to screen share.
Let's go back to our browser where we can see the collection search. So at Natural History, we have a collection search area. What happens with your...
Let me just make sure that this is actually sharing.
Okay.
There we go.
So what happens when you transcribe a record is that we take the data from the Transcription Center and then we pull it into our own database, and then it gets put online. So eventually, you know, it takes us a little while to migrate the material into our database system, but eventually it will get online. And then you can search for the records that you've created, or you can search on a taxonomic name. You can search on a collector or, you know, a collection date. And all this information goes online so that it can be shared with the whole world. And it's very useful for conservation purposes, for creating checklists of plants throughout the world. You know, there's all sorts of uses for this information.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think yesterday Rusty Russell gave a talk about using botanical collections for research, and he described specifically in California being able to use the botanical collection to see what were new non-native species that were in the area, and being able to compare over time. And so I would imagine that's one of the reasons that the dates and locality information are so important.
And the more information you have, the easier that kind of work is.
So it was funny, there somebody was mentioning that, I can't remember who said this, but they said, well, you know, why don't you just save some space and throw out all the old ones? You know, because we
I think that was my brother-in-law who said
was that?
You all can't see our faces, but we all made this shocked face at this idea.
I was giving my my sister and brother-in-law a tour, just a little mini tour of the herbarium, and showing them the specimens. Like these specimens, some of them are like a couple hundred years old. And so, what is the point of keeping the old specimens? Don't they like get stale? Don't we have better ones since then?
Newer ones. What do we need all this old collections for?
Every specimen is a piece of history. It's like throwing out an antique. I mean, but there's a lot more value to it than an antique. I mean, every specimen has its own history of people who've looked at it, people who've used it in their research, people who've based a particular taxonomic concept on it. In the case of type specimens, somebody used that specimen to name a plant, to give a new name to something that had never been published before.
And in fact, the older material is as useful or even more useful than the modern material, because we'll never get that back.
Some of these plants might be extinct. Some of them may not occur in that location anymore.
And so they give us a snapshot of that time and place that we cannot have otherwise. So yeah, our older collections are very important.
So truly, these botanical collections paint pictures, being able to see, you know, so much more than the greater sum than their individual parts, even though each of them is so individually important as well. It's wonderful. So let's see if we can stop
Actually, one quick point I wanted to make about just bringing the data into our database. The image is there. I mean, we're not just bringing in the data, we're bringing in the image also.
That's right.
So anybody, it's not just the transcribers, but anybody who's visiting our website will see the specimen. And that's actually another reason not to stress out too much over little details about like the spelling of a name, because we want our data to be as accurate as possible, but there's the specimen right there. The people who really
Right.
care about the data and about the specimens, will probably
like
want to
that.
look at the specimen and look at the label for themselves.
Mhm.
So, so having the data there makes it easy for people to search and sort and find things.
Right.
But once they have the specimen there, there's the data right there on the specimen itself.
Right. So the data helps. The data that transcribers are creating helps for discovery, and then
Exactly.
the
Absolutely, yeah,
digitization
yeah.
process
Right.
is
Yeah.
helping us to kind of go in more closely, which is a great segue actually to talking about some upcoming plans for conveyor belts and some things
Right.
we're going to digitize.
Sure.
So I think you have some examples here.
Yes, I do. Well, I have. So our big exciting news is that we have a conveyor belt coming to the US National Herbarium, which is going to take these individual specimens and put them through a conveyor belt, which will then photograph them I think once every 10 seconds. So they'll move
Let's see.
one after the next. And the plan is, instead of just taking pictures, maybe 300 a day with one camera, we'll be able to take 6,000 per day. Okay. What the group that we're
you can grab the label data. If you
okay.
show.
So what we do plan to do is start with our Fern collection, which is one of the best in the world. We have an excellent Fern collection, and there are about 280,000 specimens of ferns, and we plan to capture images of them in 3 months, and then they're going to be online for all of you. So we would appreciate your help in the coming year. This is when we're planning to start. So there's going to be a lot of material to digitize. Right now, we have about 2 million specimens that are not digitized, which is hard to even think about sometimes. But the conveyor belt will certainly help to expedite the process of digitizing our entire collection.
That's fantastic. We're really excited.
We are.
Yeah. And we have our volunteers asking other organizations, are you going to get a conveyor belt?
Oh, really?
When are you going to bring all these
Yeah.
things
Right.
together for us to transcribe as well?
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Sylvia and
Okay.
John, for
Thank you, Megan.
giving us your time today. I really cannot begin to explain how helpful it is to hear
Yeah.
from the source the context and the background of this collection, as well as some really specific and common questions that we get about transcribing these labels. Volunteers, thank you so much for joining us today. Back in the picture here. So we hope that you're going to use what you have learned and help each other, help new volunteers as they join us as well, because as you know, we all make mistakes as we're learning, and the best way to learn is to, participate in the Transcription Center, learn by doing. Keep your eyes peeled for an upcoming 7-day review challenge where, of course, we'll be reviewing some of these specimen sheets labels that we've transcribed, as well as field notes. We also will have a Women in Science Wikipedia edit-a-thon in March, hosted by Smithsonian Institution Archives, and specifically creating articles for some women collectors, some female botanists, and people who've submitted specimens as well. And keep your questions coming. Hopefully we can refine the instructions for you on the site. We're going to take some of this information that we've gathered today to improve the process. And we appreciate you spending your time with us and giving it to us. We learn together, and we're really excited to move forward into 2015 with you.
Yeah. Let me just say thank you so much for all that you've done. You're really helping us out. And I'm so excited to talk to all of you. I think that it just inspires me in my work when I talk to you and see how inspired you are by the transcriptions. So keep up the good work. And we just want to say, thank you.
Thank you. All right, everyone, have a great weekend.